I before we end, because we don't have a lot of time.
I got like 15 more minutes.
Okay, all right. I'm trying to be very.
We're making it work. We'll keep going. I can talk to you that much. It's been 20 years. Keep
I
asking.
know, I know. I definitely got to have you back on because there's a lot more that I want to talk to you about. But one, have you seen the documentary on ESPN, The Cave of Adullam?
No,
So
I'm
Lawrence
so lame. I don't
Fishburne.
watch TV anymore, man. I don't see anything.
Okay, well, so Lawrence Fishburne produced it, and my friend Jason Wilson runs it. It's called The Cave of Adullam, where David trained his mighty men. But it's a center in inner city Detroit where Jason uses martial arts to mentor primarily young black boys in urban Detroit, and to help them process trauma in healthy ways. He's wrote a couple of books. Cry Like a Man
Oh
was
yeah,
his
I've seen
first
some of them.
one. He's got big white bushy beard, bald head.
I
He's
know the
done
guy you're
YouTube
talking about.
videos. Okay.
Yeah.
I'd love to connect you guys sometime. He's awesome. But he deals with the issue of trauma and how trauma unresolved manifests in all these ways. And the documentary follows like five of the boys throughout school and how, he's working with. It's amazing documentary. You can see it online. But when you're writing about your experiences growing up, there were a few points, as page 16, page 24, page 40, you talked about trauma. And these are beautiful lines, the way you said it, because there's incredibly profound. You said, talking about yourself, and as growing up, you said, I, like so many other children, bring my trauma with me to class.
Yeah.
And then the point on page 24, you said, Black children grow up fast because our flesh stirs up complex emotions in those much older than us. That's a whole thing we could unpack for hours. During the same years when we're memorizing vocabulary words and multiplication tables, we're also readying ourselves to read and respond to grown-up feelings. And then page 40, to avoid processing our traumas, we made jokes about the violence, knowing in our hearts that there was nothing particularly funny about it. One thing
Yeah.
about Black men and our suffering, we've been trained to lie to each other. The other rule of Black male friendship, always accept the lie. And so what you're talking about in these
Yeah.
sections, and folks read the book for him, like to see the stories that these are thoughts are being packed around. But the idea of men, in particular boys growing up,
Yeah.
not being able to process individual trauma, and then collectively, collective generational trauma. There's this unspoken rule within Black culture, and you talk about it in some elements of hip hop culture and some other things. There are ways it's all coping with generational trauma.
I think that it's really interesting. I feel like God has been very merciful to me to for my last two like full length books, How Far to the Promised Land and Reading My Black, is they've ended up being, I think, important books for the moment, but when they were released.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like when Reading My Black came out, we were really asking this question as a society of, is it okay to care about these things from a place of deep Christian conviction?
Right.
And I didn't realize that at the time. This is just providence. And as How Far to the Promised Land, I was working on it, I didn't realize how much issues of trauma were going to be in the public square when the book was released.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is, a lot of, if the questions were exegetical 4 years ago, they're existential now.
Right.
And we're asking the question is, can God be good in the midst of a hard story?
Mm-hmm.
And what, in other words, like, not like what does the Bible say, but like, how do these things actually take flesh in the lives of people? And so even though this book isn't biblical in the sense of a bunch of Bible verses, I quote very little scripture in the entire book, it is wrestling with this question of, where is God in the midst of all of these difficult things that are happening to me? Mm-hmm. And me being honest about some of those traumas hopefully gives other people the comfort to be honest about their stuff too. One of the things that I'll also say, and I love the Academy, and I don't want to like yell at my brothers and sisters in the Academy, but sometimes our trauma and our life stories are hiding behind our exegesis. Mm-hmm. We're pretending like we're interpreting the Bible. We're actually working out all of our stuff in class. And so our disdain for certain things come from places that precede our opening up the Greek and the Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me to open up and say, you know what, this is the context out of which, the conviction of reading while Black comes. Here it is. Here's the difficult things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of honesty may be helpful to people. And but the truth is, I just I'm not really good at maybe I'll just always be stuck where I am as far as making it forward in life. I'm just not good at politics, and I'm not good at pretending. And so I'm just man, if you believe this stuff, just say you believe it. Or if you don't, just say you don't. Or this is the context out of which you come to lead to these convictions, tell the truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm hoping that acknowledging that pain, and I'll say one more thing about that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the hardest things to kind of navigate as an African-American Christian who's living in these kind of sometimes majority white spaces is that we come to God over and through the traumas that are inflicted upon us in part because of our race. Mm-hmm. In other words, our question of theodicy isn't abstract, how do I make sense of the goodness of God when there's evil in the world? It's how do I make sense of the goodness of God when there are people who claim to believe in the same God who are being evil to me. Mm-hmm. And so I can't separate my Christian testimony from the fact that Jesus helps me overcome anti-Black racism and those kinds of things. And so when I talk about Jesus helping me overcome those things and people deny the reality of those things, we're actually limiting my testimony.
Right.
And I have to be able to talk about all the things that happens to me, because that's part of what it means to say God is good. Imagine someone who had cancer and God helped them through cancer, and that was part of their testimony. Because don't talk about cancer, that's too depressing and that's too divisive. No.
Right.
The cancer is forever a part of my testimony.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so for me, the things that I experienced as a child and the fact that I'm a Christian as an adult can't be removed from my story, or it's not my story. It's and I'm not Jesus, right? So this is an analogy because I only know Bible stories, right? When Jesus shows us his wounds,
right,
it's saying the person who was wounded is the person who is resurrected.
Yes.
It's not a different Jesus, right?
Yes.
And so when we say, here are the things we went through, but God carried us through, we have to show the scars. We have to. We're not telling the fullness of our story.
Yeah. Did you take Revelation with Sean McDonough back at
I did. I'm a bad Christian. But I took everything else with him but Revelation.
Okay, good. I had him on it recently. We were talking about that class, but one of the most profound points he made in that class that stuck with me forever was that throughout eternity, he's the slaughtered lamb. The bearing the marks of his slaughter, it's part of exactly what you're saying. And that's what makes the salvation so glorious, is that it's through the horrendous suffering, not around it or downplaying it or saying that it wasn't really that bad.
And that's and people ask me why would you write a memoir after writing a biblical studies book? And it's precisely this question. This is the question, right? Mm-hmm. Into what kind of context does a young Black man in the South find God? Right? Mm-hmm. Is it? And so what I mean by that is, yes, there's racism. That's in the South. Yes, that's family trauma. That's part of my background. Yes, there's poverty. That's part of my background. And it's into that context that God enters. God, I'm thinking so much about Surprised by Joy, C.S. Lewis's conversion story. Mm-hmm. But you know what? I got a lot from that conversion story, but I was not meandering around Oxford with some of the greatest intellectual luminaries of convincing me to become a Christian, right? No, I was a Black kid in Alabama dealing with cops pulling me over. Mm-hmm. And in the same way that Lewis is asking about where God is in Oxford, I'm asking where God is in Huntsville, Alabama. And for kids who have to find God in that context,
yes,
they need those kinds of stories.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's what. In other words, I think that spiritual biographies, if they're going to be true, have to articulate what it means to come to faith from a particular space. And for me, it meant talking about family and racism and poverty and injustice and God and, liberal universities and conservative evangelical, all of that stuff was a part of my own background.
Yes, they have to hear those stories, and they have to see those stories embodied. And that's why I wanted to have you on the show more than just us to hang out, because I love your work in general, but because I think it's important. My friend Jason, who I mentioned at the cave, after I read How Far the Promised Land, which viewers, I read his book literally in 24 hours. It was very compelling, and I read it almost straight through. But I texted Jason. I said, "Hey man, you need to read this book. This is like his book, Cry Like a Man, which was his memoir but in urban Detroit, because I want people to see, like, people, the ability of God to reach people in their situations, wherever they are. Like, your situation is yours, and it's real, and there are, I know that there are other people out there that are like, well, I can't relate to, like you said, I can't relate to C.S. Lewis, or I can't relate to pick any other evangelical or even like Christian luminary, whatever. But they can relate to, in your case, a young kid growing up in Alabama, playing football, experiencing all this stuff with his family. Folks, this is a story of Esau's family, like in a micro level.
Yeah.
But it resonates with people all across the spectrum, and people outside of just, rural poverty, Alabama in the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
And so that's what I want readers to read the book, because they're getting a glimpse into something that's bigger than just your family, because of the way you're looking at your family struggle through a bigger lens. And you called the book, I want to make sure people ask, why is it called How Far is the Promised Land? And you said that when you looked at the history of Black people in America, that God miraculously has provided it. But you said, by miracle, I do not mean a simple rescue, an escape from danger. Instead, like the ancient Israelites finding their way in the desert, we have received just enough manna in the wilderness to make it another day. That's what I love about the book, is that there's nothing in it it does come full circle, in the sense that you have a beautiful resolution at the end when you're talking about you and your father, and that relationship is just incredibly touching. But there's nothing trite about this. It's not a Hallmark movie. It's
No.
not, it's like, this is the reality. This is the messy, muddled reality. But through it all, from beginning to end, you're showing and giving voice to God being faithful for you, for your family, and for community in general.
It's funny because I wish, like, I was talking to my wife about this the other day. There's like, my spiritual experience has always been, there's an easy way or a hard way. God always seems to take me through the hard way. That nothing ever comes easy. I'm blessed in a variety of ways, but that's just my reality. But one of the things that's really interesting is that, even though the title is How Far to the Promised Land, the passage that is underlying that entire idea is not an Exodus passage. Everyone will sit under their own vine and fig tree. There'll be no one to make them afraid, says the Lord Almighty. Mm-hmm. And for them, there was this idea that one day God was going to come back and rescue Israel. And when he rescued Israel, there would be no more suffering. No, they wouldn't have to be afraid of some invading army coming in to kind of blow things up. Mm-hmm. And they were all sitting under their own vine and fig tree. So the idea of the Promised Land was this place where people could be safe and secure with the people that they love. And when I talk about how far to the Promised Land, what I'm talking about is getting to that place where there's no one to make them afraid, and everyone has their own place. Mm-hmm. And for generations in my family, we've been striving to come to that place where there was no one to make us afraid and there was no one to harm us. And that journey, that constant thriving, is beautiful in its own right, even if we don't make it there. We don't make it to that place of safety. When I initially wrote the book, I had a different ending in mind. I planned on ending it, and the reader will have to see how it actually ends. But I planned on ending it by saying there is no promised land. We're looking for a city whose builder and maker is God. But I realized that there is a kind of home away from home that is possible for the people of God. And that even though we can't have it in the fullness here, that part of my work is to make space for more African American people, more stepped on people more broadly to have a little space to call their own vine and fig tree, even if only for a moment. There's this part, so I'm going full Bible, but there's this part in David's life. I think it's David or Solomon. So where they were all on their own vine and fig tree. They're all settled in the land. Now things go bad, right? But there are these moments where like, oh, it's good for a second, and then it kind of dissipates. And so that good for a second is fleeting because we're looking for a city. But I think that it's possible for us to have those real moments of joy and community, and I want more people to experience it.
Yeah, on earth as it is in heaven. I mean, that's what
There
we're
we go.
told to pray for. So.